At first, the Bajoran High Commander scoffed when he observed the pitifully small army that was mustering against his forces. However, he was taken aback when he learned that those soldiers were actually human beings. A tense confrontation took place in the capital city of Lutzia between the reptile warriors of the powerful Bajoran Empire and a small army of soldiers from a pre-FTL race known as Mankind. The Bajoran Empire was now in the midst of a power struggle. The human beings had been offering humanitarian assistance to the oppressed people of Lutzia, who were suffering under the harsh boot of their Bajoran masters. At this point, the Bajorans intended to put an end to the interference from the humans. It was High Commander Fenris himself who landed in the middle of the city, disembarking his dropship along with a group of snarling elite troopers who were heavily armed. He strutted across the plaza, his eyes gleaming with a cruel enjoyment as he looked in the ragged collection of humans that had gathered in front of them. The reptile warlord stood 8 feet tall. Fenris's armored division consisted of 50,000 Bajoran warriors, and there were only 5,000 human soldiers standing in opposition to them. From behind light armored vehicles, the people crowded together, clutching rudimentary weapons that were kinetic in nature. In striking contrast, the Bajorans were armed with cutting-edge plasma weapons, hovered in frightening battle tanks, and filled the air with militarized gunships. The harsh, grating sound of Fenris' laughter was accompanied by the retraction of his scaled head. He pointed one sharp talon at the human leader, a grizzled veteran called Greg Adams, who greeted Fenris with a stone visage. Fenris was able to successfully defeat Adams. Fenris spat out an extremely accented galactic common language. "Withdraw now, you scum of the earth. You can either run away from this planet with your tail between your legs, or you can stay and be destroyed. You are only given this one warning." The stare of the extraterrestrial was met with a resolute response from Commander Adams. "Lizard, we are not going any place at this time. Regardless of the circumstances, the occupation of Lutzia comes to an end today. You should get back aboard your ships while you still have the opportunity to do so." In response to the humans' brazenness, the Bajoran officers who were standing behind Fenris chittered and howled with delight. "I am going to take pleasure in destroying your kind," Fenris growled. "Your worlds will offer the Empire with valuable resources, and your survivors will make ideal slaves thanks to their ability to survive. Fenris came to the conclusion that you have about an hour to leave." With a snap of his cape, he turned around and walked back to his dropship, all the while chuckling to himself the entire way. Prior to their victory over the pathetic human forces, the Bajorans were already gloating about which Losian females they would rape first. They were confident that they would be victorious. However, Commander Adams and his soldiers had no intention of deserting the Losian people who were under their authority. At the same time that they were aware that they were outgunned and outmatched, the humans were the only hope that Losia had left. The human soldiers checked their weapons with unwavering determination, getting ready to battle to the very end of the course of the conflict. In the event if the humans withdrew at this moment, they were well aware that the Luthians would be ruthlessly crushed, and the planet Earth could not afford to show any signs of weakness in its first confrontation with a cosmic force. Because this conflict would serve as humanity's first encounter with the cosmos, it was imperative that it be a resounding victory. In a short amount of time, the Bajorans are going to realize that underestimating humanity is the biggest error they could possibly make. Upon the expiration of the 1-hour ultimatum, they would discover that even a small group of humans could do what had appeared to be impossible. Commander Adams brought his troops together as the minutes ticked down to the point where Fenris' ultimatum would expire. Standing before them was a grizzled warrior who had fought in innumerable battles, and his eyes were filled with a steely determination. "Listen up, men," Greg said, his voice resonating throughout the group of soldiers that had gathered around. "Changes have been made to the rules of engagement. Do these Bajoran cretins want to get into a fight? Now we are going to give them something that they won't forget in a hurry." As they checked their guns and equipment for the very last time, the human warriors gave a grim nod, their looks indicating that they were determined. In addition to whispering prayers to whichever gods they believed in, they loaded fresh magazines into their rifles, strapped on additional armor plates, and began firing their weapons. Greg took a step back from his soldiers and opened the radio on his radio. "My name is Commander Adams, and I am Fenris. According to your ultimatum, we will not be complying with it. You are going to have to come forward and take possession of this planet if you want it." The instant and vehement response was received. Over the communication link, Fenris growled at you, "You fool. Through your actions, you have just ensured that you and your pitiful group of primitives will suffer a horrible death. As soon as I have finished with you, I shall hang your body from the remains of your capital city as a message to anybody who would dare to disobey the Bajoran Empire." Greg simply grinned in a chilly manner. "Whoever you are, you scaly son of a bitch, come and get us." At the same moment when the deadline arrived, the Bajoran forces started to make their way toward the human wall. As Fenris watched from his command tank, he was already savoring the fact that he was about to win the battle against these apes who were only starting out. With the expectation that the human positions would be reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds, he issued the order for his armored troops to begin firing. However, rather than the anticipated bloodbath, Fenris was taken aback to witness the human lines erupt with dazzling muzzle flashes and thunderous roars that were more powerful than anything their primitive weaponry should have been able to produce. The enormous kinetic energy instantaneously liquefied the personnel that were inside the Bajoran vehicle as hyper-accelerated kinetic shots tore through the armored hulls of the vehicle as if they were made of papier-mâché. Clattering to the ground around the human positions were massive shell casings, each of which was as long as the forearm of a grown man. These shot casings were blazing and sizzling. Unfortunately, the Bajorans did not discover until it was too late that the humans had been hiding rail cannons and Gauss rifles rather than regular slug throwers. Greg pressed the button on his radio once again, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Each and every call sign devoid of weaponry. "I repeat, there should be no firearms. Allow them to have it, young men." The Bajoran rear echelon was subjected to a barrage of scorching destruction as human artillery and mortars unleashed from disguised positions. It was as if they were waiting for the right moment. As the beleaguered remnants of the aliens' lead forces slammed their vehicles into reverse, desperate to get out of the kill zone, the aliens' progress began to slow and eventually came to an end totally. The unstoppable armored spearhead that Fenris had been using was disintegrating right in front of his eyes, and he let out a raging cry. It had been the humans' afflicted technology that had fully taken him by surprise. The Earthers had been misjudged by him, and he had no intention of making the same mistake again. The Bajoran warlord smashed his hand on the turret of his command tank, drawing blood from his scaled knuckles as he did so. As soon as the day was over, he made a solemn vow that he would wash himself in the blood of every single human being that lived on this horrible earth. Loxia would be his, regardless of the price to be paid. However, even as Fenris soldiers were reorganizing themselves in preparation for another assault, the humans were quickly moving forward. When the camouflage netting was thrown back, it revealed Humvees that were equipped with quad-linked anti-tank missiles and power-armored infantry that were armed with shoulder-fired rockets. There was a moment when the hunter would become the hunted. Fenris struck his head on the holotable when he was inside his mobile command post, which caused the tactical display to flicker. "Could someone please explain to me what the hell is going on in the world right now?" The Bajoran warlord let out a shout, his eyes flaming with rage as he witnessed his armored soldiers being ripped to shreds by the weaponry that the humans possessed that were beyond his comprehension. His subordinates labored frantically at their stations, attempting to make sense of the situation in what seemed like an impossible circumstance. Krulak, a young officer, was the one who spoke up, but he did so with some reluctance. "From what we have gathered through our scans, it appears that the humans are using cutting-edge weaponry that we have never came across before. The use of rail guns, Gauss cannons, and some type of electromagnetic acceleration technology are all possibilities." The talons of Fenris flexed as he spun around on him. "If you are a fool, I can see that. To what extent, however, were we unaware of this? We received information from our intelligence that they were a primitive species." Krulak took a deep breath, and his scales became pale as he did so. "Nobody knows, sir. It is the projectiles, however, that are traveling at extremely high speeds. The force of the kinetic energy is simply too much for our armor to handle. Rather than being able to endure physical impact on this scale, it was built to withstand high-heat energy weapons." A sneer came from Fenris as he interrupted him. The battered remnants of his initial wave were falling back, as shown by the fact that he jabbed a finger at the display. "We need to get our gunships into the air and reroute the reserves so that they can target their flanks. It will be interesting to watch how their toy soldiers perform in a strafing run." The head-up display, HUD, on Commander Adams' helmet allowed him to observe the Bajoran gunships as they arrived at the front lines after taking off and racing towards them. He gave his comm a keystroke. "The MANPAD crews are ready to go. Raise the stakes, young men." Throughout the entirety of the human perimeter, shoulder-mounted launchers sprung up and began firing their weapons. The advanced seeker heads locked onto the energy signatures of the gunship like bloodhounds capturing something, and a barrage of anti-air missiles shot into the sky. This occurred just a heartbeat later. The missiles, which were short but lethal, traveled the distance in a matter of seconds, In the moments leading up to the collision, the cores of the impactors divided into dense spikes of tungsten and depleted uranium, which were supported by shake charges. They struck with the might of an enraged god's fist, forcing their way through the hulls of the gunship and tearing apart the vital systems that were contained within. The only thing that Fenris could do was stare in disbelief as his air support crashed out of the sky, leaving behind a path of smoke and flames. Following a few seconds, the human artillery altered their aim, allowing them to bombard the landing zones of his reserve forces with a barrage that was both lethal and accurate. Before they could even begin to fight, the Bajoran reinforcements fractured and dispersed around the battlefield. Fenris continued to pound the holotable, causing a dent to appear in the metal that had been solidified. The thoughts that were going through his head were racing as he attempted to devise a strategy, some method to neutralize these damned human weapons that were killing his soldiers. Someone or something had to be there. The sound of Kraluk's words quickly jolted him out of his high and scared state of mind. Mortar shells, incoming fire, and the threat is closing in. At the same time as the threat sensors in the command post were screaming in alarm, Fenrir's head snapped up and his eyes went wide. Just in the nick of time, he was able to recognize the human mortar shells that were descending towards him. Despite the fact that the Bajoran warlord opened his mouth to yell an order, all that came out was a shout of sheer wrath that was completely wordless. After that, the entire world turned white as a dazzling flash of fire and shrapnel caused the roof of the command post to disappear. Fenris experienced a brief instant of intense heat, followed by a complete absence of sensation as the shockwave smashed him into oblivion. The Bajoran lines disintegrated into a chaotic course as the news of Fenris's death spread throughout the region. In an unexpected turn of events, Colonel Naxos, the most senior officer who had survived the invasion, found himself in charge of the entire invasion force. While he was attempting to rescue what he could from the deteriorating situation, he yelled commands into his communication system. "I am Colonel Naxos, and I instruct all of the units to immediately return to the LZ in order to dust off. It is necessary for us to reorganize and replenish our supplies. We need you to buy us as much time as you can, rear guard. Put a stop to the human race." When the Bajorans disengaged and retreated, Commander Adams recognized an opportunity to maximize the advantage he had created for himself. He dialed his radio, his voice resonating with an unwavering concentration. "Boys, they are currently on the run. K-91, don't let up just yet. Your snipers are going to be necessary for me to eliminate their officers and heavy gunners. It is imperative that every infantry unit maintains pressure on their rearguard. If you have armor, you should advance and try to stop their withdrawal wherever you can. Permit me to finish this." The powers of humanity pushed onward like a tide that never stopped moving. Beginning with the elimination of Bajoran leaders and specialists in a methodical and merciless manner, sniper squads equipped with superior aiming scopes and high-powered guns began their mission. The hypervelocity shots penetrated the helmets of the aliens as if they were made of glass, causing purple blood and brain tissue to splatter across the ground that had been cratered. While they leapfrogged ahead, infantry squads advanced in bounding overwatch, positioning themselves to suppress fire with their gas weapons while they laid down their positions. While the Bajoran rearguard made desperate attempts to stop them from moving forward by firing from behind the charred wreckage of their vehicles, they were ultimately unsuccessful because they were outmatched and outnumbered. At that moment, a Bajoran platoon discovered that it had been cut off and was encircled by human armor. The aliens' nerves snapped, and one of them raised a scrap of dirty white linen off of a pole and waved it furiously in an attempt to get their attention. "To the human race, we give up." In a broken cosmic common language, the Bajoran battalion leader pleaded with his soldiers to surrender. As the Bajorans surrendered, a human team led by Sergeant Hawkins moved forward with caution while armed with weapons that had been trained on them. Hawkins made a motion that indicated the extraterrestrial beings to put their weapons down and raise their hands. The Bajoran leader growled and whipped a disguised plasma pistol from behind his back just as the men under Hawkins' command were beginning to lose their state of relaxation. He fired his weapon directly into the face of the human soldier who was leading the charge, causing his head to vaporize in a blaze of blue energy. During the devious ambush, the other Bajorans began to produce concealed weapons and open fire on their enemies. As they traveled through the air, plasma bolts smoldered and burned into the flesh of humans. Hawkins yelled out, "Shit, it's a trick of the eye." While he was attempting to take cover behind the charred remains of a Bajoran tank, he clenched his teeth in pain as a plasma bolt stung his shoulder pauldron. Instantaneously, his men replied by covering themselves with any cover they could find and firing back. While the whine of Bajoran plasma weaponry was being consumed, the thunderous roar of human gas rifles was drowning it out. Slugs that penetrated armor to a great extent tore through the bodies of the aliens, tearing them apart into bloody bits of purple meat. Over the course of a few seconds, the Bajoran platoon was reduced to shattered bodies and limbs that were twitching. Hawkins listened to the radio while his breathing became labored. There was merely a Bajoran false surrender that took place, boss. Under a white flag, a group of Cretans attempt to ambush us. He has passed away. Choi and Hernandez both sustained injuries. When Greg's voice returned, it was as icy as ice. Who is that, Sergeant Roger? As you continue to move, make sure your wounds are addressed. All call signs should be informed. When it comes to fighting, the Bajorans have broken the rules. All surrenders will no longer be accepted. It's not fair to males. This group of Cretans had their opportunity. During the course of the conflict, Ambassador Sinclair watched the live video from orbit, her face becoming more pale. The voice in her head was shaking as she opened a channel to Greg. Please allow me to complain, Commander Adams. It is not possible to just execute convicts. That constitutes a crime against humanity. The response that Greg provided was incisive and unyielding. Greetings, Madame Ambassador, with respect. This is not a police action. It is called war. I am not in a position to take the danger of putting the lives of my soldiers in jeopardy by disarming Bajorans who have already demonstrated that they will violate the laws of war. In the event that the moment comes, I will gladly accept Fenris' formal surrender. Nevertheless, until then, we will proceed in this manner. Greg terminated the transmission before the ambassador could say anything in response. His gaze was intent as he turned to face his troops. This is what I heard, gentlemen. Keep moving forward. There will be no stopping until each and every one of these scaly goons is either dead or running away. Get away of here. The efforts of the human forces were redoubled, and they pushed the Bajorans back 1 block at a time as they were covered in blood. Despite the fact that the aliens were now in full retreat, the humans were closing in on them and harassing them with artillery strikes and sniper fire. In the event that it was necessary, they would chase them down like dogs all the way to the landing zones with them. As the sun began to fall over the battlefield, the Bajoran forces that had been severely damaged retreated to a hilltop position in the hopes of regrouping and fortifying themselves until reinforcements could arrive. Colonel Naxos, whose face was covered in soot and blood, yelled commands to his troops as they rapidly dug trenches and constructed fortifications. His face was covered in this mixture. While pointing to the anti-air batteries that were being hauled into position, Naxos yelled out, "Get those heavy guns positioned into position. It is time for me to establish a perimeter. Keep your wits about you, sentries. We are going to be attacked by the human race." Naxos was approached by a young lieutenant who had his palm put over a bloody cut that was located on his forehead. "I have received word from Commander, sir. We are currently being approached by a division of armored personnel. They will arrive before the sun rises." A flicker of optimism could be seen in Naxos' eyes as he nodded. "That's good. All that is required of us is to wait till then. I want you to tell the men to dig deep. Today is going to be a very long night." At the same time as the Bajorans were working madly to strengthen their fortifications, the humans were already making their way toward them. The Bajoran position was viewed through a pair of night vision binoculars by Commander Adams, who was standing on the edge of a ridge overlooking the Bajoran position. As his mind raced with computations, he took notice of the heavy weapon emplacements as well as the anti-air batteries. Greg lowered the binoculars and focused his attention to the persons who were gathered behind him who were dressed in black. "Attention, young men. We only have one opportunity to do this. It is imperative that those AA weapons be removed before morning. We are going to use everything we have in the air to attack them once they have fallen to the ground." In spite of the black camouflage paint, the Special Forces troops nodded, their expressions displaying a stern expression. One final check was performed on their suppressed guns, during which they made certain that each magazine had armor-piercing ammunition. In the gloom, Sergeant Hawkins' eyes sparkled as he assured his superior that we would be able to complete the task. "They won't even be able to comprehend what has happened to them." Hawkins was firmly grasped by Greg on the shoulder. "Have a successful hunt, Sergeant. Throw them into hell." While the humans were establishing a perimeter around the hilltop and lighting the Bajoran positions with flares and searchlights, the Special Forces team started their approach in a stealthy manner. Using the cover of darkness and the difficult terrain, they moved in small groups in order to conceal their progress with the landscape. In order to conceal themselves, the soldiers engaged their adaptive camouflage as they got closer to the Bajoran lines. The battle suits they wore shimmered and moved, and the colors and patterns blended in perfectly with the world around them. At first glance, it appeared as though they disappeared into the darkness, transforming into spectral shadows that were hardly discernible. In the midst of the distant explosions and gunfire, the troops were able to sneak past the Bajoran sentries without their footsteps being noticeable. The demolition charges were placed on the anti-aircraft guns and missile batteries, with each placement being designed to cause the most amount of damage possible. As soon as the charges were established, the troops disappeared into the shadows and retreated to a safe distance. From his vantage position, Greg observed the explosion while keeping his finger hovering over the detonator. He whispered over his radio that all of the squads should report in. The leaders of the team checked their charges one by one to ensure that they were in place. While taking a deep breath, Greg hit the button on the device. There was a sequence of blinding flashes and loud booms that burst from the edge of the mountaintop. As a result of the explosions, the Bajoran fortifications were completely destroyed, the anti-aircraft weapons were reduced to twisted wreckage, and shaking waves were transmitted throughout the earth. As a result of the explosions, several Bajoran warriors were rendered speechless or injured, and they were thrown from their feet. Amidst the mayhem, the troopers of the Special Forces immediately sprang into action. With their suppressed guns coughing out short bursts of lethal fire, they materialized out of the smoke and flames. Even before they could raise their guns, Bajorans who were stunned fell to the ground since their armor was no match for the armor-piercing shots fired by the troopers. As he stumbled out of his bunker, Colonel Naxos reported that his ears were ringing and that his vision was blurry. His soldiers were being slaughtered with a merciless efficiency by shadowy beings that were moving through the wreckage. With a mixture of wrath and dread, Naxos raised his plasma gun, and his hands began to shake. Prior to his being able to shoot, a soldier materialized in front of him, appearing as nothing more than a shimmering shape against the flames. In the moment when Naxos felt the impact of the bullet slamming into his skull, he witnessed the light of the muzzle, and then he saw nothing at all. During the time that the surviving Bajorans were firing blindly into the night, the soldiers vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a sight that was completely filled with destruction. There was a lack of leadership and dispersion among the Bajoran soldiers, and the anti-air defenses were in ruins. A sad smile appeared on Greg's lips as he watched the devastation spread before him. The Bajorans had convinced themselves that they were superior, and they had failed to recognize the persistence and inventiveness of the human race. As a result of their arrogance, they were now the ones suffering the price. However, the first stages of the conflict had barely begun. It was imperative that the humans be prepared for the Bajoran reinforcements who were still on their way to the destination. Greg worked his radio with a resolute tone of speech. Every single unit is getting ready for the second phase. At the break of dawn, air support will arrive. Permit me to finish this. At the same time as the first rays of morning were painting the horizon in various shades of orange and red, the air was filled with the roar of engines and the clatter of treads. The reinforcements from Bajor had come, and they were a seemingly unending column of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that were churning out clouds of dust as they approached the human lines. Through his periscope, General Zaxos did a reconnaissance of the battlefield while he was in the lead tank. The fact that he observed smoke rising from the mountaintop where Colonel Naxos had made his final stand led him to believe that the colonel had already fought the military forces of the enemy. "All units charge ahead," Zaxos yelled into his communication system. "Create a ring around the human beings and crush them between our forces." The Bajoran tanks charged forward, their drivers eager to grind the human upstarts beneath their treads as they drove forward towards them. Following closely behind were infantry transporters, which were brimming with heavily armed warriors who were prepared to eliminate any that survived. The scream of human airplane engines suddenly filled the air, and it was a new sound that filled the air. In response to the sight of sleek, angular fighters flying across the sky, Zaxos looked up, and his eyes widened in fascination. Because of their vectored thrust engines, the human craft moved in a manner that was unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. They were able to do movements that appeared to violate the rules of physics. The leading fighter made a sharp turn and aligned himself with Zaxos' tank. When a panel on the underside of the aircraft opened, a guided bomb was released and began to fall towards the Bajoran vehicle descending from the sky. Before the bomb went off, Zaxos had a fraction of a second to experience a burst of adrenaline and anxiety. Before detonating, the tandem warhead successfully penetrated the strong frontal armor of the tank, making it appear as though it were composed of paper. It then buried itself deep within the tank. Zaxos and his crew were quickly destroyed by the explosion, which reduced the once fearsome war machine to a charred husk of twisted metal. In a manner that was both cruel and precise, the other human warriors followed suit and began raining guided munitions down on the Bajoran armored vehicles. Bombs were dropped on engine compartments, ammo stockpiles, and fuel tanks, causing the Bajoran forces that had gathered together to be consumed by flames and destroyed in a sea of destruction. There was no way to get away from the human ground forces, despite the fact that infantry transport vehicles was violently swerving and their drivers were desperately trying to avoid the smoking ruins of the tanks. One by one, the Bajoran transports were destroyed by cutting-edge tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, whose armaments were directed by cutting-edge fire control systems. The poorly armored vehicles provide no protection against the human guns that are operating in the area. As Commander Adams stood atop the hill, he observed the commotion that was taking place below him and realized that it was time to launch an assault. He issued an order that all of the units advance over the calm. Do not let up on the pressure. We must not give them the opportunity to reorganize. The forces of humanity pushed forward like a unified one, spilling down the mountainside like an avalanche of steel and fire. There were scattered remains of Bajoran armor, and tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, led the charge, their cannons booming as they engaged them. As they fought the adversary with short bursts of lethal fire from their Gauss rifles, infantry squads followed closely behind, leapfrogging from cover to cover until they reached their objective. A solitary Bajoran soldier was seen hiding behind the charred wreckage of a transport vehicle in the midst of the intense destruction. He was so eager to get a message to high command that his hands were shaking as he pressed the buttons on his field radio. His voice was trembling with fear as he screamed over the microphone, adding, "This is Private Kraylock. Unfortunately, the reinforcements have been destroyed. Again, the reinforcements are no longer available. We require extraction as soon as possible." As a trio of hypersonic bullets impacted him in the back, a burst of Gauss rifle fire cut his message short. "Please, you have to get us out of this situation." His internal organs were pulverized, and his lifeless body was hurled forward into the dust as the rounds smashed through his armor as if it were made of nothing at all. A great distance away, in the center of the Bajoran city, the High Council sat in startled silence as they listened to the final signal that Kraylock had sent. It portrayed a picture of complete and utter defeat, with the young soldier's voice resonating with the deep dread that he was experiencing and the noises of complete and utter destruction in the backdrop. The counselors exchanged glances of shock and amazement as the recording came to a finish from the beginning. Because they were so assured of their supremacy, they were so certain that the unsophisticated humans would not be able to compete with the power of the Bajoran war machine. However, at this point, it was hard to deny the truth. In every situation, the humans had outfought and surpassed them, and they were armed with technology that was much superior to anything the Bajorans had ever attempted to achieve. And at this moment, the pride of their military was lying shattered and ablaze on the plains of Lozuria. Craxon, an elderly warhawk, was one of the counselors, and he pounded his head on the table while his face contorted in anger. He hissed and said, "This is not possible. I am sure there is some sort of error or trick involved." Despite the fact that Craxon knew the words were empty even as they left his mouth, he believed that the Bajoran Empire could not be defeated by simple monkeys. The evidence was directly in front of them, in the form of the cries of desperation that their suffering warriors were making and the smoke that was rising from the battlefield. The Bajorans were confronted with a horrifying new reality, one in which they were no longer the unchallenged masters of the galaxy, and one in which their very survival hung in the balance. The humans had done the unthinkable, and now they were facing this new reality. On the battlefield, Greg was positioned atop the turret of his infantry fighting vehicle, IFV, from where he watched as his advancing men liquidated the remaining pockets of Bajoran resistance in a methodical manner. Despite the fact that his nostrils were filled with the aroma of burnt flesh and smoldering metal, he paid no attention to it. His full concentration was on the objective at hand, which was to achieve a complete and utter victory over the adversary. Over the communication system, Sergeant Hawkins informed the commander that a large number of Bajoran soldiers decided to surrender. "Where can I find your orders?" Recalling the betrayal committed by the Bajorans in the past, Greg's eyes narrowed together. There was a brief moment when he was tempted to give the order for his soldiers to shoot down the aliens who were surrendering in order to make them pay for their hypocrisy. However, despite the fact that he detested admitting it, he was aware that doing so would do him no better than the Bajorans. He knew that mankind needed to be better, and that they needed to demonstrate that even in victory, they continued to uphold their beliefs. The tone of his voice was forceful as he responded, "Disarm and detain them. Those who have been injured should be treated, but they should be kept under close watch." Additionally, they should be made aware that any additional treachery will be dealt with deadly force. In response, Hawkins recognized that he was correct. "We will take care of it." While the human soldiers were making their way to secure the Bajoran detainees, Greg permitted himself a little smile despite his gloomy predicament. Although he was confident that he had won the battle for Latvia, he was aware that this was only the beginning. This loss would not be taken lightly by the Bajorans on any account. After being humiliated by the upstart humans, they would return with new weapons and new methods intent on destroying the humans who had humiliated them. On the other hand, Greg and his allies would be prepared to face them. They had demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that mankind was a formidable adversary, and they would continue to demonstrate this on battlefields throughout the stars for as long as it was necessary to ensure that humanity would have a position in the galaxy. Greg was well aware that the path that lay ahead would be arduous and painful, but he was also certain that humanity would never give up fighting, regardless of the odds or the difficulties that they faced. They would never give up their fight, because this was their destiny, their birthright, to stand tall among the stars, to make their own path, and to demonstrate to the galaxy what it meant to be human. In addition, may God bless everybody who attempted to obstruct their path. Admiral Kralok was seen walking back and forth on the bridge of his flagship, his clawed feet making a clicking sound against the metal deck. A holographic display was located in the middle of the bridge, and it displayed the current situation on the surface of the planet. The Bajorans were trapped down by the human forces, and they were responsible for a significant number of losses. A young officer by the name of Zanuck, who was Kralok's second in command, approached him with caution. "We have received a signal of distress from the surface, Admiral. Congratulations. They are urging that the human sites be bombarded from orbit immediately." When Kralok turned his attention to Zanuck, his eyes narrowed. "Even if our own troops are still on the ground, we are being bombed." Zanuck took a deep breath, but did not give in to the pressure. "Oh yes, sir. There is an excessive amount of human resistance. That is the only way they can view things." With his thoughts racing, Kralok switched his attention back to the holographic panel. He was aware that an orbital strike would most certainly result in the deaths of a significant number of his own warriors, yet if he did not take action, the humans would kill all of them regardless. The decision was made by him. In gloomy tone, he issued the command to get the main batteries ready to fire. "You should aim for the human positions, but you should make every effort to stay away from our own forces." With their fingers racing over their consoles, the crew of the bridge hurriedly complied with the request. On the surface of the planet, Greg's radio began to make a crackling sound. "Please, Commander, we have a message coming in from orbit." The tone of Sergeant Hawkins' speech was strained, and the energy signatures from the Bajoran spacecraft to the surface batteries were consistent. In his head, Greg muttered an expletive. He had hoped that this would not happen, but the Bajorans were becoming increasingly determined. He yelled on the radio commanding all of the units to get ready for the orbital bombardment. "Spread out and look for cover right away." By jumping into trenches and bunkers and huddling behind the wreckage of Bajoran vehicles, the human soldiers made their way to a bay as quickly as they could. After a few moments, the initial energy bolts collided with the ground, and the collisions caused enormous plumes of dirt and debris to be dispersed in all directions. Massive craters and clouds of superheated plasma were left behind as a result of the bolts, which incinerated everything they came into contact with. In the explosions, both human and Bajoran soldiers were killed quickly, and their bodies were reduced to ash before their very eyes. As the ground began to shake beneath him, Greg clenched his teeth and braced himself for the possibility that the shock waves would knock him off his feet. The human tank was struck by a bolt, and the armored vehicle vanished in a dazzling burst of light. He watched as the bolt struck the tank. In spite of the fact that the Bajorans were attacking the human fortifications, Greg's forces continued to fight back. A barrage of flak and missiles was launched into the air by human anti-air batteries, which commenced fire. As the Bajoran ships were struck, their shields erupted into flames, and the force caused the gigantic warships to shake violently. On the ground, human tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, emerged from their cover and fought the Bajoran landing troops with their cannons on high decibel levels. A violent struggle ensued between the Bajorans and the enemy, with plasma bolts and railgun slugs crisscrossing the battlefield. Greg took the initiative and led from the front, with his personal infantry fighting vehicle serving as the point of the human spear. He was able to observe the Bajoran perimeter disintegrating as a result of the unrelenting attack by humans, with the alien soldiers falling back in a state of chaos. He yelled over the entirety of the camp, "Push forward. Do not slow down. We have them completely under control." The Bajoran landing zone was getting closer and closer to the human forces as they drove forward. Burning wrecks of Bajoran dropships and the bodies of alien warriors littered the ground. The ground was covered with debris. Just in front of Greg's armored fighting vehicle, IFV, a large energy bolt suddenly struck into the ground, and a shockwave caused the vehicle to be thrown into the air like a toy. Following a brief period of weightlessness, Greg experienced a bone-jarring collision when the interplanetary vehicle, IFV, returned to Earth. Greg's head shook in an attempt to clear his vision and ears, which were both ringing. A gash had been made in his forehead, and he could taste blood in his lips. He could also feel blood dripping down his face. All around him, the interior of the IFV was a chaotic mass of consoles that were sparking and lights that were flickering. It was possible for him to hear his crew groaning as they struggled to lift themselves up. Greg pressed the buttons on his radio, his voice hoarse. Every single unit, a status report. In spite of his head hurting, Greg struggled to get to his feet. After wiping the blood from his eyes, he gazed around the interior of the IFV that had been destroyed for some reason. He had a team that was injured but still alive, and they were already moving to get their weapons and equipment. With a raspy tone, Greg yelled out, "Stop making noise." "How are you doing, Chen Ramirez of Hawkins?" His team members reacted one by one, their voices weary but determined as they did so. Even though they were bleeding and bruised, they were prepared to continue the struggle. Following the opening of the hatch, Greg climbed out of the IFE and took a look around the battlefield. What he witnessed caused his blood to become ice cold. An avalanche of enormous energy bolts descended from the heavens, each one destroying anything it came into contact with. There were blinding bursts of light that caused tanks, infantry, fighting vehicles, IFVs, and men to vanish, leaving behind nothing but molten metal and charred dirt. Despite the fact that they were willing to sacrifice their ground forces in order to defeat the humans, the Bajorans were shelling their own positions. Greg felt as though he had been punched in the belly by the understanding. His voice was agitated as he pressed the keys on his radio. After falling back, all of the units disperse. Leave the death zone as soon as possible. An instantaneous reaction was made by the human forces, which dispersed like leaves in the wind. Tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, revved their engines and weaved unpredictable patterns in order to dodge the rain that was falling from above. As they advanced over the terrain, infantry units quickly divided into smaller fire teams and utilized their adaptive camouflage to blend in with the environment. As Greg stared helplessly, a pair of human tanks vanished in a dazzling flash. The energy bolt reduced them to molten slag in an instant, and Greg was unable to do anything about it. As he tightened his fists in anger, he muttered an expletive beneath his breath. On the other hand, a fresh voice could be heard crackling over the radio just as he was on the verge of total despair. "I am Captain Alvarez of the Iatas Titan, and I am reporting to you, Commander Adams. Cavalry has arrived at the scene." Greg suddenly jerked his head up, and his eyes widened. He looked up at the sky, barely daring to hope for anything. The enormous bulk of an Earth warship could be seen there, coming from the clouds like a wrath angel. The sunlight shed a brilliant light on its hull, which was crammed to the brim with point defense turrets and weapon batteries. The Bajoran vessels attempted to maneuver, desperate to bring their weapons to bear on the human behemoth, but the Titan's artificial intelligence-assisted targeting systems tracked their every move, predicting their trajectories and adjusting fire in real time. The Titan opened fire, its advanced mass drivers hurling hypersonic projectiles at the Bajoran vessels. Under the unrelenting onslaught, Bajoran ships trembled and shattered into pieces, their hulls splintering like kindling across the surface of the water. As a result of the destroyed spaceships, debris and escape pods were released, and they hurtled downward onto the surface of the planet. Greg experienced a wave of renewed hope while he was on the ground. Through his resolute voice over the radio, he rallied the surviving members of his army. "I am Commander Adams talking to all of the units. There is a change in the air. Prepare yourself for the last push. We are going to expel these cretins from our world for good and for all time." The human soldiers gave a thunderous cheer in response, their spirits being lifted by the sight of the Earth fleet flying through the air above them. The Bajorans would be frantic to evacuate their last troops before the Titan could destroy their entire fleet, and Greg knew that they would be desperate to do so. It was his command to relocate his anti-air forces, which resulted in the establishment of a lethal obstacle course for any Bajoran dropships that attempted to land. As they surged over the battered battlefield, his armored battalions sought to cut off the Bajoran retreat. Their engines roared as they charged across the battlefield. To escape being hit by the Titan's fire, the Bajoran dropships approached the planet at a low and rapid speed, skimming the surface of the land. They were surrounded by a screen of gunships that soared in front of them, fire plasma from their weapons at the human positions. The anti-aircraft units belonging to Greg began fire, causing a hail of missiles and flak to be sent into the sky. In an effort to divert the fire away from the dropships, the gunships maneuvered and ducked in a variety of ways. Despite the fact that a number of the gunships burst into flames, spiraled out of control, and crashed into the ground, the dropships continued to arrive, with their pilots resolute in their mission to rescue their fellow soldiers who had become trapped. At that moment, Greg hopped into his personal tank, which was a big combat machine that was rumbling with force. A shot was aimed at a Bajoran armored transport as he turned the main cannon around and positioned it to fire. In response to the lock being chimed by the computer of the tank, Greg pressed the trigger. With a roar, the gun unleashed the hypervelocity bullet, which slammed into the Bajoran vehicle and tore it apart from the inside out. The fight had escalated into a vicious melee that was taking place in close quarters all around him. Amidst the debris of blazing vehicles, human and Bajoran soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat, forgetting their weapons in the frantic effort to stay alive. Greg witnessed an alien soldier from Bajor tackling a human trooper, with the alien's claws tearing at the face of the human trooper. Greg pulled his sidearm and fired a round through the Bajoran's skull, causing purple blood to splatter over the ground. Suddenly, a flight of human fighters sped overhead, their missiles fixed onto the Bajoran dropships. It appeared for a brief moment that the Bajorans may be able to surpass the humans through sheer numbers and ferocity. However, the Bajorans were prevented from doing so. A trail of white smoke was left behind by the missiles as they descended from the sky in a rapid manner. They collided with the dropships, and the explosions caused the hulls of the dropships to be ripped apart smoothly. There were infernos burning inside dropships, and their crews were incinerated by the flames that caused them to crash to the earth. As their last chance of evading capture faded right in front of their eyes, the Bajoran soldiers who were stationed on the ground watched in terror. The aliens, one by one, surrendered by laying down their weapons and raising their scaly hands in a gesture of surrender. In an attempt to avoid falling victim to yet another ruse, the human warriors moved in, but the Bajorans had already lost the battle. In spite of the fact that his face was covered in blood and soot, Greg climbed out of his tank. In the sky, where the Titan hung like a guardian angel, its cannons continued to fire the fleeing remnants of the Bajoran fleet. He stared up at the sky. The fight had come to an end. The humans had emerged victorious. Nevertheless, as Greg took in the destruction that surrounded him, he was aware that the price had been quite steep. Everywhere you looked, there were dead and injured people, both human and Bajoran equally. Greg was well aware that this was only the beginning. In addition to the fact that the Bajorans would return, this time armed with new weapons and new plans, there were further dangers that were hiding in the shadows of space. And for the time being, the humans may take pleasure in their triumph. On this gory day, they had demonstrated to the entire galaxy what they were capable of, and the Bajorans would not forget the lesson that they had learnt from this experience. Greg Adams was standing in the center of the rubble of the Bajoran encampment as the smoke began to dissipate and the echoes of the war began to die away. The odor of burned flesh and smoldering metal assaulted his nostrils, serving as a gloomy reminder of the bloody job that had been done throughout the day. He was surrounded by human warriors who were taking care of their own. The wounded were triaged by the medical staff, who applied pressure to wounds that were gushing blood and injected morphine to stifle the screams of those who were dying. A sorrowful expression could be seen on the faces of soldiers as they gathered dog tags from the deceased and readied their siblings and brothers for the long trek back home. The eyes of Greg swept across the battlefield, taking in the shattered fragments of Bajoran tanks as well as the mangled corpses of the personnel that had been aboard them. The crimson and purple blood that mixed together on the charred ground was a gruesome visual representation of the brutality of the fight. He became aware of a disturbance around him. There were two human troops who carried a Bajoran officer in front of him. The alien's outfit, which had been spotless in the past, was now frayed and smeared with grime. A look of defiance and contempt could be seen engraved into the reptilian features of the Bajoran as he scowled up at Greg. Despite the fact that you may have emerged victorious from this conflict, the Bajoran growled, his words dripping with poison, "You have only succeeded in bringing greater agony upon yourselves. A disgrace such as this will not be forgotten by the Bajoran Empire. We are going to come back, and we are going to exact our demise." The Bajoran's gaze was matched by Greg, whose own eyes were as resolute as flint. The tone of his voice was low and menacing as he leaned in close. He hissed at you, saying, "You had your chance for peace. You made the decision to go to war, and now you're going to have to deal with the repercussions. Greg switched his attention to the guards who were holding the Bajoran. I want you to remove this piece of garbage from my view. Protect the prisoners so that they can be transported to Earth. Soon enough, they will be held accountable for their misdeeds. During the time that the troops were dragging the Bajoran away, Sergeant Hawkins approached, his face covered in blood and soot. I have received word from orbit that the Bajoran fleet has gone missing. At the moment when the Titan appeared, they immediately jumped into hyperspace. An orbital domination has been achieved by the flyboys located upstairs. Greg gave a slight nod while maintaining his gaze fixed on the horizon. That's good. But Hawkins, this is not even close to being the conclusion of the story. That will make our work down here a little bit simpler. There will be a return of the Bajorans, and they will be returning for more bloodshed. It was Hawkins who spat on the ground. Allow them to do so. We will be prepared for the second round. Nothing was mentioned by Greg. The price of triumph was something he was well aware of. He had lost decent men and women today, troops who would never see their families again, and those who had survived would bear the wounds of this conflict for the rest of their lives, both visible and invisible. He had lost them. As Greg stood there and took in the scene of the destruction, he was overcome with a profound sense of exhaustion. Never in all of his years of duty has he experienced such exhaustion and a sense of emptiness. He gave himself permission to ponder for a brief period of time whether there was an other approach that could have been taken, and whether the cost of victory was worth the toll that it imposed on the soul. However, he ignored such ideas with a smile. Not only did he have a responsibility to his warriors, but he also had a duty to the people of Latvia. The Bajorans had planted the seeds of the wind, and now they would pick the fruits of their labor. The shoulders of Greg were straightened, and he turned his head to face his men. The work that needed to be done was still outstanding, and he would see it through to its conclusion. This was the route that he had chosen, whether it was for the better or for the worse. It was the way of the warrior, the path of the protector. It was something that he would walk for at any cost. Following the dispersal of the dust across the battlefield, the human soldiers immediately began the arduous process of providing medical care to those who had been injured and securing the Bajoran prisoners. As they moved from one victim to the next, medical personnel swiftly applied pressure bandages and administered morphine to individuals who were in excruciating pain. The groans of those who had been injured and the barking orders of the officers who were organizing the triage filled the air until it was completely full. Taking a moment to wipe the sweat and grime from his forehead, Greg's gaze scanned the turmoil that was occurring on the battlefield. The sight of so many people, both human and Bajoran, falling to their deaths, caused him a considerable deal of emotional distress. The actual face of battle, stripped of all majesty and heroism, was revealed in this depiction. He was about to turn around and head back to the command post when he noticed a small figure in the distance. By the time she made her way through the wreckage, a young girl of Lassian descent, who was probably no older than 6 or 7 years old, was holding a doll that had been damaged to her chest. She had tears running down her face, but she walked with a determination that belied her age. Her face was covered in tears. She approached Greg, her wide eyes fixated on his face as she approached him. Over the cacophony of the battlefield, she mumbled, "Thank you," and her voice was hardly discernible due to the distractions. "We are grateful that you did not let the beasts get us." She reached out and pressed the doll into Greg's hand as she held it out. A lump began to grow in his throat as he stared down at the minor toy that had become worn. Because they had freed her people from the control of the Bajorans, this child regarded him and his men as heroes and saviors. But Greg was aware that the truth was far more nuanced than that. The human race may have emerged victorious from the conflict, but the price had been steep. He thought about the families back on Earth who would soon be confronted with the dreaded knock on the door, the news that their loved ones would never be returning home. He was thinking about them. He looked out over the battlefield and watched as the bodies of those who had been killed were being loaded onto transport ships. The sacrifices of these heroic men and women would be indelibly written into the history of this war. But for their families, the sorrow of loss would never entirely heal. Greg's mind moved to the Bajoran soldiers, many of them nothing more than conscripts who had fought and died for a cause they may not have completely understood. In the end, there were no true winners in war, only those who survived to bear the burden of the fallen. Her medic approached, his uniform stained with blood. "Sir, we got the triage center set up. We're ready to start evacuating the wounded." Greg nodded, handing the doll back to the little girl. "Get to safety," he told her, his voice gentle. "The monsters are gone now." As the child scampered off, Greg turned to the medic. "Let's get our people home." The two men walked towards the waiting transport ships, ready to begin the long journey back to Earth. Greg knew that the road ahead would be difficult, with many more battles to be fought and sacrifices to be made. But he also knew that he and his men would continue to fight to protect the innocent and stand against the darkness that threatened to engulf the galaxy. For that was the duty of a soldier and the price of being human. As the transport ships lifted off, carrying the wounded and the fallen, Greg looked up at the stars, wondering what the future held. The war was not nearly finished, and the Bajorans would undoubtedly be back seeking revenge for their defeat. But the humans would be ready, their perseverance stronger than ever in the face of adversity. And as Greg looked down at the small battered doll in his hand, he was reminded of why they fought and what they stood for. For in the end, it was not about glory or conquest, but about protecting the innocent and preserving the light of hope in a galaxy consumed by darkness, and that was a cause worth fighting for at any expense. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.